Introduction to Romans chapter 8, verse 28. Does the promise of all things working together for our good include personal tragedies? Romans chapter 8, verse 28. When faced with adversity, faithful Christians find great comfort in the promise of Romans chapter 8, verse 28. And we know that to them that love God, all things work together for good, even to them that are called according to his purpose. This passage assures believers that God's ultimate purpose will prevail, even when life presents immense suffering. However, does all things truly include personal tragedies such as the death of a child, divorce, terminal illness, or crippling accidents? Does this verse mean that God directly causes these hardships to bring about good? In our lives, suffering is inevitable, but what role does God play in it? Understanding this can be, well, quite challenging. Is suffering a punishment or a test? Does God allow it to happen, or is he actively involved in our pain? These are questions that many of us grapple with, and finding answers can sometimes feel elusive. Paul clearly includes suffering in his discussion of all things in Romans chapter 8, verse 28. Earlier in the chapter, he speaks of the sufferings of this present life and how we groan under them, as mentioned in verses 18 to 23. He identifies ways in which suffering is endured, hope sustains us, as stated in verses 24 to 25. The Spirit helps us in our weakness, interceding on our behalf, according to verses 26 to 27. All things work together for our good, as mentioned in verse 28. Tribulation, anguish, persecution, and even death cannot separate us from God's love, as highlighted in verses 35 to 39. Clearly, Paul includes suffering in all things, yet it is essential to understand what this promise does and does not mean. This understanding can bring us closer to comprehending the depth of God's love and the purpose behind our struggles. While God can bring about good from evil and suffering, there is a difference between God bringing good out of suffering and God causing suffering for our good. Certainly, God does not shield his children from all adversity. At times, he may even allow hardship for a greater purpose, such as Paul's thorn in the flesh from 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 7. However, this does not mean that every tragedy is directly caused by God's will. Let's explore some biblical examples that illustrate how God can bring good out of suffering. One of the clearest demonstrations of God bringing good out of evil is the story of Joseph. His brothers sold him into slavery, yet Jehovah was with Joseph, as written in Genesis, chapter 39, verse 2. Through a series of hardships, Joseph rose to power in Egypt and ultimately saved his family, including the very brothers who betrayed him. Reflecting on this, Joseph told them, "As for you, ye meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring to pass, as it is this day, to save much people alive." From Genesis chapter 50, verse 20. God did not cause Joseph's brothers to sin, nor did he desire their evil actions. However, he used their sinful choices to accomplish his greater purpose. The ultimate example of God bringing good from evil is the crucifixion of Christ. God's will was not for innocent men to be murdered, yet through the unjust death of Jesus, salvation was made possible for all mankind. Though Christ's death fulfilled God's plan, those who crucified him were still guilty of sin. The crucifixion was an evil act, but God used it to bring redemption to the world. Understanding tragedy in light of Romans 8:28. In a similar way, God can bring good from personal tragedy. However, we must be careful not to claim that all suffering is directly willed by God. Telling a grieving parent that their child's death was God's will, or suggesting to a suffering believer that their hardship is God's doing, can be deeply damaging. Instead, we should comfort them with the assurance that God can bring good from their pain, even if we do not understand how. We must also recognize that some suffering occurs simply due to the fallen nature of the world. Ecclesiastes 9:11 reminds us that time and chance happen to all. We cannot always identify God's providence in specific events, but we can trust in his ability to bring ultimate good from them. McGarvey and Pendleton capture this truth beautifully. God makes any road lead to good and glorification, and especially those roads which seem to run in the opposite direction, so that we may regard those things which appear to argue his hatred and neglect as, on the contrary, the strongest evidences of his love and care. Though Joseph may have struggled to see any good while in chains, in hindsight, he recognized God's providence at work. Likewise, we may not always see how God is working in our suffering, but we can trust that he is. Suffering as a means of spiritual growth. All right, let's delve into the essence of spiritual growth and wrap things up. If we respond to suffering with faith, trials can prepare us for eternity. Paul writes, "We rejoice in our tribulations, knowing that tribulation worketh steadfastness, and steadfastness, approvedness, and approvedness, hope." Romans chapter 5 verses 3-4, cf. James chapter 1 verses 2-4. Suffering can refine our faith, as mentioned in 1 Peter chapter 1 verses 6-7. Teach us dependence on God, as stated in Psalm 119 verse 71. Strengthen our perseverance, as Romans chapter 5 verses 3-4 say. Lead us to greater holiness, as highlighted in Hebrews chapter 12 verses 10-11. Romans 8:28 assures us that all things work together for good. But this promise is not universal. It is for those who love God and are called according to his purpose. This purpose is to glorify us, as stated in Romans 8:29-30, and not even suffering can prevent this promise from being fulfilled. Rather, Paul confidently asserts that trials do not defeat us. Instead, we are more than conquerors through Christ, as mentioned in Romans 8:37. The answer to whether Romans 8:28 includes tragedies such as death, illness, and suffering is yes. However, this does not mean that God causes all suffering, but rather that he can use all suffering for our ultimate good. As we reflect on these profound truths, it becomes clear that our faith in God's plan is crucial. Even when faced with the darkest moments, we must hold on to the promise that he is working all things together for our good. Though we may not always understand why we suffer, we can trust that if we love God and obey him, as stated in John 14:15, he will weave even the darkest moments of our lives into his greater purpose. We must not allow the devil to use suffering to discourage us, but rather trust in God's providence to bring about our ultimate victory through Christ, as mentioned in 1 John 4 verse 4 and chapter 5 verse 5, and Revelation 17 verse 14.